wish so much I could see you in person, but this is the next best thing. And it's always so awesome to be a part of SoSI because the vibes are so good and the support is so wonderful. And everybody always brings a lot of personality and vulnerability to what they're doing here. And I always really love and appreciate that. So I'm happy to be here again. I know there's a couple returning students, and so I'm always nervous about saying the same thing I did the last time. But I think everything I say is always connected, I guess. It's true for any composer talking about their work. So I figured that we could just play some music, and I want this to be the most useful to you guys. So I want you to feel totally comfortable jumping in with questions anytime. But I thought I would, just to put a general umbrella over what I was thinking about when I chose these three pieces. I was talking with Jason about this last night, how he was saying that you guys have been talking about the idea of artistic voice and how to find it. And I was saying like, oh yeah, the $1 million question, composers are always wondering about this. And a lot of times they feel like in order to have a strong artistic voice, they have to focus on one thing or focus on one kind of music to really sort of make a signature impression and have that be their trademark and so on and so forth. And over the years, I have really struggled with that because I love so many different kinds of music, as I'm sure you guys do too. I mean, when you really love music, you love lots of different kinds of it most of the time. And it can be really hard to know what you want to say. It can be really hard to know, from day to day, what kind of a composer you want to be. Our time on this earth is so limited, and it can feel like, oh, but I want to make sure that I get to that. And I also really love that. And so about 7 or 8 years ago, I decided to just really stop worrying about it and really made a conscious effort to try to open myself up to whatever it was that I was hearing and wanted to say. So I thought I would play 3 different pieces of totally different, well, maybe not totally different. See, this is the thing, it's also subjective, right? But for me, pieces where I was coming from very different places, emotionally and psychologically and technically, and what I was thinking about at the time in terms of my writing. And I thought I would start with one piece that I wrote right after I had made this conscious decision to really try to embrace all the sides of myself. And that was this piece called Unremembered, which was a song cycle that I wrote in 2013-14. I'd written it a few years after this other song cycle, Penelope, which had been commissioned. And in Penelope, I had been asked to write music that specifically incorporated a lot of folk and pop influence. The playwright Ella McLaughlin had said that she wanted the character of Penelope to be a sort of every woman who listened to all kinds of music and would sing in folk and vernacular styles. And that experience really taught me so much because it made me realize how much I'd been shutting all of that out of my classical writing over the years, especially when I was at school. And this was all music that I had actually been writing in high school. I mean, this kind of pop influenced, folk influenced. I was really into Joni Mitchell and Kate Bush in high school. And a lot of my piano music sounded like something between Joni Mitchell and early Debussy, like baby Debussy. So anyway, when I had this commission for Penelope, that process of writing that piece really made me realize how much I'd been repressing. And I said, I want to try another piece like this, where I actively summon these other influences. And I got this commission from Roomful of Teeth to write a bunch of vocal pieces. And I asked my friend Nathaniel Bellows to write some text, and he wrote about some childhood experiences, childhood memories of anxiety and fear, in the way that children experience trauma and sort of grok it as something else that's more digestible. For instance, you may have a death in the family, but instead of thinking about what happened to that person, you think about a witch in the woods or ghosts that you see, outside of your living room door or whatever. For him, that was how he dealt with his childhood difficult experiences. So we wrote this music that was specifically about childhood anxiety and so on. And I thought I would play that piece first. And Jason is on the percussion. But this piece, I should say also before we dive in, I really wanted to bring in, I grew up loving so much pop music, and I really wanted to bring in the style and the approach of pop recording into this piece. It was a very active part of the compositional process for me. So as I was thinking about writing the music, I was thinking about electronics and thinking about, well, okay, the bassoon can't speak this loudly to compete here, but I'm going to really pump it up in the mix, and I'm not going to obey the laws of nature with acoustics. I'm just going to rely, a bit on the studio. And it was a fun and scary mental task. But anyway, so I thought I would play that piece, and then we can go on from there. This is called The Barn. Okay, so thanks. So yeah, so that's kind of one side of what I think of as my musical personality. And this is the larger point that I think I want to make about this whole conversation more than anything else. I think we all have musical personalities, and I think that's more important to focus on than your voice, because we all have, you know, things that we gravitate towards, no matter what style we're working in, no matter what we're saying, we all have things that we gravitate towards. For me, I'm really interested in harmony, and I tend to use a lot of stacked sixth chords, and that sort of orients me no matter what I'm writing. But more than that, this idea of narrative and storytelling is what grounds all of my music. Any kind of piece or style that I'm writing, and I'm always thinking about this idea of tension and release and push and pull. And that set of goals, that line of inquiry, is something that I think is common to all of my music. And that gives me a sense of feeling like I'm not floating in space as a composer, but rather that I have this set of values that guide everything that I write. So this next piece that we'll listen to is this piece for Piero Percussion Ensemble that was commissioned by Grand Valley State a few years ago, music ensemble. And Bill Ryan, wonderful guy, came to me and said, we just want you to do what you do. And I remember thinking like, well, what do I do? What do I do? Like, I don't know what he has in mind. Is he thinking of Penelope? Is he thinking of my orchestral music? Like, and I didn't ask him. And then the question sort of drove me crazy, because I was like, well, I want to please him. I want to write what he wants to hear or what he thinks he's commissioning. And I started thinking about this whole thing. And I wrote back and I was like, so by what I do, like, what did you have in mind? He's like, you just be you, like, do whatever you want to do. And I was like, okay. So the assignment was to include a piece of field recording of a voice of a composer who had inspired us. So I chose this conversation between Arvo Pärt, who was my first favorite new music composer, conversation between him and Bjork. And they're talking about the freedom to write whatever you want to write. And this exact conversation, it's a wonderful interview. You guys should look it up if you haven't seen it. They're like speaking their own language. It's really funny. But anyway, this piece, this performance that you'll hear doesn't have the field recording, but one thing that Arvo Pärt said in there is, you are free, you can choose. There's lots of points between, I think he says something like, you can kill a person with sound. And if you can kill a person, you can also do the opposite of killing, which is a very beautiful poetic way of saying, I'm not sure what, but you know what he means. He's saying that you can express love, you can express hate, you can express all these different emotions. And so I decided to, not knowing what I was going to write, I decided to sit down and write on the concept of being free. And then this piece just came out. And so I tried to have it be free of agenda or direction, and that didn't work. The piece always tells me things that it wants to do, and I follow those guidelines. But anyway, so this is that piece. It's called You Are Free.
Woo!
Oh, thanks. So yeah, just a little meditative piece on the idea of what to write. So the next piece I thought I would share is a movement from a mass that I wrote for choir and 12 instruments. It's called Mass for the Endangered. I wrote it in 2018 and recorded it the following year. And this just showcases my deep, deep love of choral music. I grew up singing a lot of choral music. I attended the summer program at the American Boy Choir School for 6 years and really fell hard for choral music. So this was a chance for me to dive into all of those loves, but I also wanted to bring a sense of all the other vocal music I wanted that I loved. I didn't want to feel like I was only drawing on the classical side of my influence. So certain movements more than others have sort of a folky sensibility with some of the vocal lines. But this movement I'm going to play, I'm not sure that's necessarily true for, but I thought I would share it nevertheless because it's, I think of this as being a very me piece, but it's very different from the other two things you've heard. So with that, we can listen to Sanctus Benedictus. It's about endangered animals.
Sarah, at our morning hang this morning, it's already been called at least one participant and possibly more's favorite piece of music. So it's in the air here already. In really
that's incredibly sweet. I mean, if it's it's like 6 or 7 minutes. I could do an excerpt if we're short on time, or we could just listen to the whole thing.
No, let's do it. And then there's been a couple nice questions in the chat that I've been keeping
Okay.
track of, and though I know there'll be a lot to talk about, but definitely let's listen.
Sure. Thanks.
The Zoom clap.
Yeah, so video for that was by the amazing Deborah Johnson, who also goes by Candy Stations. She's just amazing. So wanted to give her a shout. So yeah, now I thought we could just open it up for questions or
well, in that one, Calvin had just asked who recorded it. That was Galacantus?
Yeah, that's a Galacantus. It's this vocal ensemble made up of Americans sorry, it's run by Gabriel Crouch, who teaches at Princeton. He's head of choral activities. this recording was done with all British singers, but sometimes he has Americans and British together singing over on this side of the pond. But yeah, so they're the ones who recorded it. We recorded it in a church in London.
Awesome. There was a couple of really cool questions. And after your first recording, Hannah had a cool question. Hannah, I'm happy to read it, or if you want to unmute, that's great as well.
Yeah, I can read it. Hi, can you talk a little bit about how like focusing on more of the production or like the mix as opposed to like just the acoustic elements of, or like performance elements of like the piece for Unremembered, kind of informed like your compositional process for the entire album?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I thought about it a lot as I was composing. I thought, well, I mean, I want this piece to live on the stage as well as in the recording studio, of course. So I tried to make it as acoustically appropriate and workable as possible. But that said, I knew that I could crank up the guitar or the, clarinet in this passage or that. And then when I got into the mixing and the editing process, it was the second time I had done that. I'd done that once with Penelope, and the second time around, I just felt more aware of everything that the engineers were doing. And so I knew how I had a better vocabulary to ask for what I wanted. And then fortunately, I was working with a friend of mine on the editing in the early part of the mixing, and he was generous with his time, and we just had a lot of time to try things. And then then we did a second round of mixing with this amazing producer, Andrew Sheps, who's, worked with huge names like Adele and Red Hot Chili Peppers and it's ridiculous, Michael Jackson, ridiculous list of people. He was a friend of my friend Shara, who's singing on the album. And so he basically gave us this ridiculously great fee rate, and we were able to work on the mix with him. And of course, he had a lot of other ideas for things that I felt like weren't working during the first mix round. So I would say that most of the compositional mixing, so-called, happened in the studio, of course. And if you have the opportunity to have a situation like that where you can work with a friend or somebody who isn't charging you an inordinate amount of money to try things, it's so valuable because there's so much to try and there's so many ways to get what you want. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, sure.
Sarah, when this one toured, I remember you went on tour a couple of times in the Netherlands. I remember there was a US tour. When Unremembered toured, was it amplified in general as well? And so that was something that you could just deal with in that space as well?
Yes, and I was at the board sort of running the mix. So that was, I mean, with an engineer, of course, but I was like, raise the violin one, lower. I was kind of, and then he just would let me usually handle the fades. But yeah, we had everything amplified, and that was the best way to do it, we found, except for when we worked with an orchestra, which were a few times, a full orchestra. Then, of course, just the singers were amplified and a couple instruments, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we had a conversation earlier in the festival just about drum set for a second, and there was a moment where that didn't make sense, and then I feel like it was microphones that started to make that make sense. And so yeah, I imagine that was the case. The one time I've seen Unremembered, it was amplified. I didn't know how it toured.
It's a funny paradox that drums need to be amplified. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I know it's strange but true. Yeah. Erica, I'll do better looking in the chat now. There's a lot of awesome questions, but Erica, I had tagged yours after the Eighth Blackbird piece. Yeah,
so I was just really enjoying how that piece sort of stayed stayed within like a sonic and emotional space for the whole piece. And as a composer, I struggle with like allowing myself to stay within one space for a whole piece. And so I was wondering if you could talk about embracing stillness and staying within one emotional space.
Yes, that's such a great question because I used to struggle with this too, Erica, really badly. I think, are we frozen? Can you guys hear me? Okay. I used to struggle with this myself, and I think a lot of young composers struggle with this. You sort of have this anxiety about not wanting to hold the floor or bore your audience with an idea for too long. You sort of feel this need to rush on to the next thing, and having a lot of ideas is a great thing. I remember this one really seminal lesson I had with David Lang when I was at Yale, and I brought him this orchestra piece that had so many different ideas. And he was like, this is beautiful, but it's a highlights reel. And I was like, oh, you're totally right about that. He's like, yeah, it's like one great moment after another. He was like, go listen to Sibelius. There's all of this long space between the big moments. And that gives you a chance to sort of earn the big moments and appreciate them more. And he was totally right. And I became obsessed with Sibelius, by the way. And that had an enormous influence on the way that I started trying to think about composing and trying to allow myself to just own a space. I think particularly as a woman, sometimes that can feel hard to do because we're so conditioned to like, okay, make your point and sit down, you know, like don't babble, don't ramble, don't whatever. And so for me, it was really hard to do this, to just sort of allow myself to be in one space and not worry about boring the audience. But David Lang said something else like, you know, music isn't always about the high points of our lives. It's not always about the day you fell in love or the day you got married or the day you died. It's often, he's like, life is often just about having a cup of coffee. He's like, try to make a piece that's just about having a cup of coffee. And so it's a funny little metaphor, but it really stuck with me. And I tried to do that a bit with this Arvo Pärt piece, just kind of like imagine myself sitting with a cup of tea and allow that to be enough. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love that so much. We haven't had a chance to hang with David in a long time, and I'm really appreciating those tidbits because they really
So
sweet.
David.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I'm keeping an eye on the tapped, and of course anybody
Sure.
can raise your hand and unmute. I'm just trying to facilitate, not be a dictator here. So please have thoughts. But Kendall, you asked, I think as far as I can see, you asked the other kind of awesome, thick question that needed to be answered. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. I thought it was really interesting at the beginning of your talk when you were kind of discussing kind of crossing genres or creating whatever you felt like, okay, maybe this is more pop, maybe this is more contemporary, and kind of crossing through genres. And I'm more on the performer side than the composer side right now, but I don't know if you have any other thoughts about even just the listening and like what we consume and what kinds of music we play, because I find myself a lot of times feeling like, oh man, I've just been listening to like pop music all week and I feel badly about it. Like I'm a performer. I should be listening to like really in-depth, like classical contemporary, or I've been listening to like Broadway for a month. What am I doing? And like going through these phases. I don't know if you have any thoughts about
Yeah.
embracing all of those genres.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So many thoughts. I mean, first of all, I think there's so much value to listening to all different kinds of music in order to play classical music. And particularly, I think there's so much value to listening to pop and vernacular musics because those musics are all about the feel, right? It's all about the feel. It's all about like where the performers are placing the beats. Like Led Zeppelin is this great example of a band who's like has nailed their beat stretching down to a science, you know, and things are always just a little bit behind, and it gives it this amazing sense of feel. And one thing that I encountered with a lot of classical performers who told me they had never listened to pop music or had only listened to classical growing up was that they sometimes struggled with that a bit, struggled with the sense of feel and relaxing the beat a bit, or, you know, or rushing it, or if you wanted it to stretch in a certain way, it was sometimes more challenging. And I think, you know, in those cases, like listening to different kinds of performance practice, the kinds that you're exposed to in pop music can be enormously beneficial for your classical performance. So I think there's nothing but goodness to be gained there. And nobody should ever feel bad about listening to the music they love. First of all, you got to listen to the music you love. That's what keeps you in love with music and keeps you having a passion for it that you can apply to any music that you're performing. But, you know, also there are tons of different kinds of classical pieces out there that, you know, if you find that you're only wanting to listen to pop, it may mean that you're not aware of the right classical music that could move you. And maybe it's worth trying to talk to some friends or explore some other kinds of classical styles or approaches that might speak to you more. but I think it's all good. I think the more music we can listen to, the better, you know, and music of any kind, stripe or style, it's going to inform what you do, as long as you love it. So.
Woohoo! All right, the chat, you should look at the chat sometime, Sarah, just because it's over, you know, there's an abundance of good vibes in the chat. But I think, did I miss anybody's questions that were in the chat? Because we can do, please raise your hand now when you have a question for sure. Or just, yeah, let's go with the little hand
Are
raise.
you able to save this chat, by the way? Yeah?
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that, but that would be awesome to look back on. Cool. Yeah, I would, whoever wanted to go next.
We have Zachary.
Hi, yeah. Something you said struck me, that you just prioritize, or a better way of thinking about it is like find your musical personality rather than find your voice. Like I was just wondering if you feel like, you know, sometimes that's a phrase that gets tossed around a lot, you know, like find your voice. I don't know, do you feel like that's something restrictive for young composers to hear?
Yes, I think it really can be. I think it's a whole lot of pressure. And I also found that when I had teachers who were saying, you haven't found your voice yet, they would also give me a list of pieces to listen to. So the message was, you'll know you found your voice when it sounds something like this. You know, it was like this conflicting message of find your voice, but here's the pieces you're allowed to listen to and study. And, you know, maybe they were trying to open me up a bit, but the message that I often got was that there was a certain kind of acceptable voice and other voices that weren't as acceptable. And I think it's really dangerous to conflate those messages. So, you know, listening to as much music as possible is great, but I don't think that anyone has the right to tell another person that they haven't found their voice yet. I think that's very toxic and ridiculous, and I don't believe in that at all. I think that every composer has a voice. Every composer, you know, every human being has a voice, whether they've even composed yet or not, you know? So the question is getting to really know yourself and identify what you love and what you're drawn to so that you can really home in on that and lead with your strengths. I think so often we're taught to sort of, this is a phrase that my husband uses, I'm going to borrow it, but so often in school, we're taught to shore up our weaknesses to a uniform level of mediocrity and not to sort of focus on what we're really good at and what we really excel at and what we really love, because usually what we excel at is what we love. So I tend to think that it's great to listen to all the different kinds of music out there. But if you're feeling pulled towards writing a certain kind of piece or playing in a certain style, by all means, you should focus on that and follow that bliss, because that's telling you who you are and what you have to say that nobody else can say.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for quoting that. I feel like that shoring up your weaknesses versus driving towards your strengths. I feel like being around the Princeton composition community has really taught us and so percussion that too. Like I think that's so good. Yeah, go for it, Hannah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that so much. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like kind of like what inspired you to start Amsterdam Records, and like if that kind of drive to like play and create music in different styles kind of drove that decision for you, and also just like your process in doing so.
Yeah, that absolutely drove it. So I started the label with a good friend of mine, Judd Greenstein from Yale, and we'd had tons of conversations in grad school about aesthetics and about the shoulds and shouldn'ts we'd received from our teachers, like this belongs in your concert music, this doesn't, you know, things like, oh, 4-bar phrases are out and no octaves and no chorus verse structure, no, you know, all these things that are pop music influence and just other arbitrary rules. We were feeling frustrated by that, and we were thinking like, what would our music sound like if we just embraced everything that we loved? And that coincided with the commission that I had for Penelope, which I talked about earlier. So it was this kind of synergy of discussions we were having about these issues. And Judd and I kind of looked at each other. Judd needed to put out a record for his ensemble, and there was nobody who was saying yes to it. And we kind of looked at each other and we were like, we just need to do this ourselves. You know, it's born of necessity. And so we had this other friend, Bill Bertel, who is also very like-minded about these issues. We had a lot of the same conversations with him. And so, yeah, it was kind of born of frustration, but also, you know, excitement, wanting to create a space that could be like a home or an asylum almost for music that didn't fit in the typical classical sort of ideas of boundary and genre. So yeah, that was the MO behind it, and it was a ton of work, and we had no idea what we were getting into, but yeah, it's a labor of love. So.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Definitely want the participants to have as much time as possible. In the Mass for the Endangered, one of the things I was writing in the chat is that I'm so impressed not only that it's a wonderful piece, but that actually the kind of sacred modality in like contemporary choir music is actually a pretty difficult bullseye to hit and make it really good and satisfying. I grew up doing a lot of like church anthems in church choir on Sunday morning, a lot of which are really like very kind of bland and cliched and mediocre, just like miles and miles and miles of it. And so I think one of the things for me when I heard your piece that was not just the general, wow, this is a really amazing piece, but it was like, I felt like you actually like threw the dart and hit this very, very small spot of how music like that could actually feel fresh, and where I could feel like I was hearing something really new within that idiom. And so I was kind of curious about, in terms of classical influences on a piece like that, like when I hear the harp, I think of Britain and choral music. Were there any classical touchstones that were particularly meaningful to you with that piece, or was it more your just overall general immersion?
Definitely some strong classical touchstones. I think the Mozart Requiem is a huge one for me. For a Requiem, also the Brahms Requiem. I sang a lot of this as a kid. I love a lot of early music. There's, you don't necessarily hear that maybe as strongly, but I love Gesualdo and Josquin and Lassus, and going back earlier, Hildegard and Periton and Leonin. And so all of that sort of figured in there as well to a degree. But I also, as I mentioned earlier, I love Arvo Pärt. I mean, there's obviously a lot of Arvo Pärt influence in there. I love David Lang's music, so there's some influence there. Yeah, but it's funny because when I hear it, I hear a lot of pop music influence too, and I can't necessarily put my finger on it, but it's there. So yeah, it's something about the harmonic rhythm or the way that I land on certain chords, to me, feels very poppy. But then again, Mozart is very poppy in my mind. So yeah.
Love that. You're gonna have to teach me how Mozart is poppy. I'm a willing student. Yeah, Latin.
Sarah, going back to your kind of more song cycle like pieces, like I was just curious, when you're writing, do you tend to start with melody and then, setting the text to melody and then build out the accompaniment or the rest of the texture around that, or do you start with like a bed and then write melodies over it, or how do you approach setting text to like more monophonic text, not the choral texture?
Yeah, that's a great question. It sort of differs for me from piece to piece. Sometimes I would, I mess around a lot at the piano when I first get a bunch of text, and I sort of see what mood my hands are translating my ideas into. I take a lot of walks, and then I sing ideas into my phone. So sometimes it starts with me thinking about the text and hearing a certain melodic idea, but sometimes it starts with a textural idea or a chordal idea at the piano that's more about the mood and the vibe of the lyrics. So I'd say it's sort of half and half. It's like a lot of these songs began with an ostinato or a series of chords, and I knew that I was going to come up with a melody on top of that. And then sometimes it would start with a melody and I'd work in the opposite direction. So it sort of depended on how the text hit me emotionally. Yeah. Sorry, that's a bit of a, it's sort of an all over the place answer, but.
Yeah, do you tend to spend, or do you spend a lot of time with the text just kind of on its own before you start ever listening to music?
Yeah, I try to really meditate on the text, actually. Text is super important to me. I mean, I think it is to most composers. You really want to express what the text is trying to say. And I'm super fascinated by psychology and translating words into emotions and all of that. So I spend a lot of time really trying to, like, I talk a lot. If I'm working with a living poet, I spend a lot of time talking with them about the text to make sure I understand exactly what they mean or what they were thinking about. I take copious notes and then I really meditate on it. And as I mentioned, take a lot of walks thinking about it, and just sort of see what comes to the surface in me as a response emotionally.
Go for Carl. You guys can just boom, boom.
Just really quick, sort of like from the more maybe business perspective, how do you navigate kind of the space where your music is, sometimes it's more choral, maybe sometimes it's like that produced, very produced video that, that you were talking about, working in the studio and making a tour happen. Like, are you marketing things differently? Are you like putting together, everything very specifically?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Because in the case of Unremembered, I worked really hard to make that tour happen myself. I mean, I had some interest from a couple remote corners, like this festival in Holland wanted to do it and an orchestra in North Carolina wanted to do it. And then I was like, okay, that's great. Now, how do I make a tour out of that? And so I hired a manager to help me and we figured out, and then we sent the piece around to a bunch of other presenters and we lucked out and had a bunch of interest and were able to set up a European tour and a US tour. But that was really, as I said, my own legwork, figuring that out. I do have a publisher. They don't do things like that per se. They try to get my work performed by classical ensembles. So that's how the Mass is being performed now, is through their sort of advocacy. That said, we are, Gabriel, the conductor of the Gallicantus Ensemble, and I are talking about trying to put together a tour and work with my publisher to sort of help set that up. But yeah, it's weird. And I in the sense that I feel like this composer whose career is oddly shaped and has these different weird sides of personality to it. The tour in Europe was like we were driving around in a van. It felt like a rock band. That's very different from my classical life of going to orchestra performances and other things like that. So you can feel sort of fractured a bit in your identity, but at the same time, Unremembered is also being performed by other classical ensembles, performances that I have no supervision over, which is fine and nice and all part of being a composer. You have to be open to not having control over every performance. So I'm happy to see that a piece like Unremembered is having a life without me. But I think it's great if you can muster the energy to make performances happen on your own for those pieces that don't really fit in the infrastructure of classical music. It just takes a bit of legwork. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, Calvin, why don't you, this feels like maybe a last question and that'll be great.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for sharing, Sarah.
Of course.
Yeah, just love the stuff you've been saying. Quick question about process. Do you have any like tried and true methods of breaking yourself out of writer's block when you experience that? And like if are there like, do you take a break, or is there something that you regularly do to kind of just navigate that inevitable space during a creative process?
It's such a great question. I get writer's block quite often. And I have a lot of, I'm a very anxious person in general, but I have a lot of anxiety about composing. And the beginning of a piece for me is a very fraught thing. And I tend to procrastinate, which is terrible. And sometimes that procrastination, especially if I don't have a deadline, if I have a piece, like right now I'm working on this opera, it's not due for a while. And it's really easy for me I have to set little deadlines for myself so that I don't procrastinate too much. But in terms of the writer's block, I think what works the best for me in the moment is getting up and moving my body. I mean, that sounds really literal, but I mean it. Like I have to, if I'm sitting at the computer or the piano and I don't have any ideas and I'm frustrated, I get up and I go take a walk, because I've learned from years of experience that continuing to sit there for hours does nothing. And you only get deeper into a hole of self-doubt and frustration. So after like 45 minutes of trying, if I'm not happy with what I'm coming up with, I get up and I go take a walk. I force myself to do that. And I find that, I'll make a phone call, I'll try to get my mind off of the piece. And then I find when I come back to it, I feel much better, much more relaxed. And generally then I have ideas. It's usually like, but I have to go do something else, wash the dishes, walk the dogs, go exercise, do something else to get my mind off of it. And then I go back. With periods of extended writer's block, which I've had, that's usually more connected to like, to speak frankly, moments of depression or severe anxiety that I've experienced, where it can just be really hard and I'll get into a self-doubt K-hole and I can't get out of it. And for that, there's no real easy way out, I'm afraid. I mean, it's sort of a long process of climbing back up. Like I went through a bout of this during the COVID period, as many composers did. And I found that I had to get back on the phone with my old therapist and, just really talk through all these issues, sort of the way that I did when I was in my 20s often, and had these long periods of writer's block. And that really helped. Writing in a journal helped. Really kind of listening to more music, remembering why I'm doing this in the first place. I think that can be really helpful to feel that sense of joy again with music. Even going back and listening to pieces you've written before, just to remind yourself like, oh yeah, I can do this. Like I did that, I think that can be really helpful. So it's tough. I sympathize. Writer's block is a menacing foe. And it's tough. So, but you can do it. You can break out of it. So it's possible. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, Sarah. That answer and all your answers is so always such a pleasure to have you here. Can we all unmute and give love towards Sarah? Yay! Yay!
You guys.
You were awesome. Thanks for being here. And I threw in the chat. I know I have a quick meeting with our individuate group, and I've been told we can just hang here. So anybody who didn't get that, but you're all adding to the chat. I already saved the chat. Now I got to add all this other good love that's coming. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. It's great to see you guys, and I look forward to our lessons. Have a good SoSI until then. Bye.
Thanks, Sarah.
My goodness, more and more good love. Hey Shelby, would you be more official and save the chat in the good way? I was just super DIYing it. I did the 3-dot thing and then I had no idea where it went, and then
yeah, I saved it. No worries.
That'd be lovely.
Yeah, we got it.
Awesome.
Well, I'll let y'all get to it. I think I just made you the host. So
yeah.
Yeah. Hope everyone's doing good.
Awesome.
Sweet. We'll be jumping off.
See you. How's it going, crew? At least one thumb up, possibly two. Two. Yeah. I just figured, I think when we hung last time, I didn't even look at the schedule to realize we weren't getting together today. So I just figured two things, like a quick check-in to see how the skeleton's coming together and see how it's going for everybody. And then have a chat a bit about who is interested in jumping in to mix this thing later in the week when we get to that moment, or video ideas. I love this meta thing of Jen walking into Alex's room and then leaving, and that's always happy. So why don't we won't take too long, but so if this looks amazing, it looks like a lot of stuff has been thrown in. Whoa, awesomeness. And if we were to listen to it, Luciano, did you look at it last night or did somebody else?
Yeah, I put it together a little bit earlier. The end sections, I think I have like a good strong foundation. I think the middle parts can still have some more structure, I think. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, why don't we just take a listen to see where it's at, knowing that somebody's part could have been accidentally muted or something. There may be too much of something, or I'm sure there'll be tons of things, but just to know where stuff's at. And do you know, Luciano, I just reloaded what was there, I think. Is everything in terms of like, there's a couple things muted, most stuff isn't muted. Does that feel about right?
I think I muted some stuff just to like organize things. So I think you can go ahead and just turn those on.
Awesome. Let's see, what's the worst that could happen? Wow, this is scary and exciting. Okay, cool. Let's listen. We can all, if I mean, you all may have listened already, but we can take some notes and see where we're at, and then figure it out.
Historically, low-income residents have lived closest to the biggest contributors to climate change and pay the cost of their legacy pollution.
We just passed another Earth Day while eco-fascists continue to cry apocalyptic warnings about global warming.
This is what we are.
But the truth is that if global warming is occurring, that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
There is also a correlation between high heat and asthma. It is unconscionable that pollution industries are disproportionately in communities of color.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science?
I'm okay.
Yes.
From the beginning, the universe left an original law. This law applies to our Mother Earth and our Father's Sun. The sun's heat gives energy and provides life to all things in the world.
This is what we are. This is what we are.
Systemic factors make communities of color more vulnerable to climate change. According to the American Public Health Association, communities of color are more likely to experience pre-existing health conditions and poor living conditions than their white counterparts.
I'm okay.
Lack of power and representation in political and economic systems makes it difficult for these communities to build climate resilience or the ability to prepare and respond to extreme events that occur due to climate change.
This is what we are.
The forest is a representation of all people and things that have existed. What has been lost only exists in our thoughts and spirits. We can perceive that the good energy within Mother Earth has been decreasing. Every time we cut trees, we create an imbalance in Earth.
This is I'm okay.
Environmentalists want us to believe that there is such a thing as clean, renewable energy.
And protect this land. We're running out of time.
This is what we are.
They know it's not warming anymore. We're actually cooling.
This is what we are. This is what we
I'm
are.
okay.
This is what we are.
This is what we are.
I'm okay.
This is what we are. This is what we are.
This is what we are.
This is what we are.
This is what we are. This is what we are. This is what we are. This is what we are. This is what we are.
This is what we are. This is what we are.
This is what we are.
This is what we are. This is what we are.
This is what we are.
This is what we are. This is what we are.
This is what we
This is what we are. This is what we are.
This is what we are.
This is what we are. This is what we are.
This is what we are.
This is what we are. This is what we are. This is what we are.
This is what we are.
This is what we are. This is what we are. This is what we are.
Across North America, other Indigenous communities are stepping up to formulate and enact climate action plans to protect their way of life.
We won't hurt ourselves anymore. We won't hurt ourselves anymore.
of Northern California released its climate adaptation plan with a recommendation to return to prescribed burning, an old idea that might help to ease California's wildfire problems.
We won't hurt ourselves anymore.
The Tulalip tribes of Washington state are relocating nuisance beavers from urban areas back to traditional watersheds to help lower river temperatures and aid salmon populations. They are also redirecting agricultural runoff for electricity generation.
We won't hurt ourselves anymore.
The Jamestown Sikhlalam tribe in Washington is removing invasive butterfly bushes from the banks of the Dungeness River to help protect its salmon. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of Montana are gathering and planting seedlings of the white-bark pine that are more resistant to warming-related diseases such as blister rust. Alaskan tribes are using microscopy to identify harmful algae blooms spurred by warm waters. The list goes on.
Whoa, it's a lot of information. It's very cool. Cool. Can I tell you, I should have been looking at the chat. I'm always bad at looking at the chat when I share a screen. I never have it up. Yeah, so I wonder.
All I said is that I noticed the places I put some of my things had changed, but
Right.
that doesn't necessarily bug me. I just wonder if somebody had gone in and done more of like a creative take on something that I put in.
Yeah, it could
I
have
think
been
that's
the yeah. Last
Yeah,
name.
that's like definitely the second half. I didn't do any of that, and I think it sounded really good. And the first half, I had placed the things where I would have liked them to be, but I'm totally fine with it being more of a collaborative thing too. Like the overlapping you chose to do seems like it was intentional to get it to be a little bit more like chaotic. Whereas I think things before were like we each were getting our turn to talk, but I'm not sure that's how it's supposed to be, you know?
Right. Well, that's what one. So I wonder a couple of things. I wonder, Luciano, I wonder if you had a moment in the near future. The only thing I think there should be, in terms of the big structure, there should be an overlap, more of an overlap between the fourth part and the third part. So I think, it's those drones, will stay in the third part, and then the individual part will start their thing, and then the historian part will add on, and those drones will leave. So there'll be, there was probably 30 seconds or 45 seconds or something there that we could look at. I wonder if you could look at it from a macro level in the near future and pull some stuff. And then I wonder if we could kind of like, before tomorrow, just appoint a few folks who could be like, hey, would you look at part one and think about some mixed stuff and move in? Would you look at, really, I think we're thinking part 1, 3, and 4, and 2, I feel like it's kind of part 1, really, like the end of part 1. Because one thing I feel like maybe we didn't talk about yet is the kind of weird and cool ways that parts deal in part 1, where like the historian, should be kind of like an equal, and hear them a bit at the beginning, not so much at the end, but will be kind of steady. And it's possible because the historian part is one that was easy to orchestrate and have fun with. There's a lot of parts doubling it. So I feel like it becomes very important. Whereas it was harder to figure out how to double the individual part. And so the individual part was less important. So I think the way it works, I made a diagram that I wonder if I hold it close enough if you can see. So this is the way part one is supposed to work, where like the historian is kind of steady and chaos starts really big and gets less important, and the newscaster and individual become more important. So I think like what you were saying, Jen, like I think newscaster and chaos kind of should and could be talking over each other at the beginning, kind of like what was that, you know, and we can bring the chaos level down, you know, and then the news can become more important and the individual part can become more important. And Gavin, I don't know if there's anything interesting for you to look at doing, where if there were any samples that you could look at doubling some of your notes, or I know Jen early on, I don't know if that's here, you know, had kind of improvised in the individual style, like how we can add some more sound to the individual part so it becomes more important. Is there somebody that it feels like would like to take on some creative ideas in part one? Before tomorrow, meaning take what's there and start to mix it a bit.
I definitely I'm super interested in mixing as much of this as you want. Like this seems like a lot of fun. I'll definitely be doing it in Logic, not in Soundtrap though.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that's great. What if Gavin, unless somebody wants to wrestle that out of your hands, I think you're hired. I think that's wonderful. I love entering this with joy and not trepidation. Like there's two ways you could have said that statement, like, holy crap, there's so much going on here, I don't want to touch it. And you were like, I can't wait to get into this, will be so fun. So I think that's great. And I've been connecting some folks in groups. I'll connect you with Christian. You know Christian. You've worked, I don't know. I'll make sure to connect you with Christian too. Christian can be of service to help with the mix. I wonder, do you think it's possible with small amounts of time, like in 30 minutes, could you go into Soundtrap and mix the first part, not in terms of like, this is a final anything, but in terms of like, you know, set some levels or draw some automation to help make the bigger shape work?
Yeah, for part one.
For part one, yeah. And so then I wonder if we can just check off a few things between today and tomorrow, and then we'll check off more things between tomorrow and Thursday. But if we can, you know, so I feel like, is there somebody that would be interested in listening to part three? Which feels like there's a lot of good information in there. Even when I started to find out where the drones were and bring them down to balance them a little bit, it already felt a lot nicer to me. I would say somebody could go in there and feel out how the voices can overlap a bit more. So to me, I think there's this idea of puffs of smoke with the voices. So we can thin out some of the voices, I think, and clump them a bit into a few. I think I was mentioning last time, like So did 3 puffs of smoke, but we were on the sparse side. I think we could do more, but I think we're really active in there. And I think the idea of like, you know, you have this feeling here, and then I think the shape of the little interlude would come down, and the shape of part 3 would be pretty like, you know, pretty sparse and static and chill, and beautiful. I think if somebody went in there, I think you can also think about things like reverb, or Gavin, when you get to it, I think we can think about things like reverb in the second section, or putting delay on voices. We can start to treat things if we want. Is there anybody that would want to check out part 3?
I won't have the time to do it tonight, but I do have a couple things I wrote down about that section. When I was putting my parts in, I was thinking a lot about how because Maritza and I have the same drone, I was thinking a lot about how my articulation reacted with her bow strokes. Sometimes I would have them line up when she would change bow direction. I would put my articulation there, or if it felt like a sort of canonic moment with some of the other parts, I would think about that, and a lot of that got shifted. And then also the drones, I think about halfway through were supposed to shift, and some of the drones aren't aren't necessarily moving. I don't know if we want them to move at the halfway point, everybody
Yeah.
together, or to be a little more organic, but I think that's something we have to really pay attention to in this section. And then something else.
I think to clarify that Luciano was under the impression he should move around everything and mix it. I think that's why that happened. So if that's not what we intended, we should
Yeah,
let
no, I'm not
him...
trying to tear him
No, I
apart
know.
or anything. I'm
I
just
don't-
saying
I
these are
don't
things
think
I
you are.
noticed.
I
'Cause
just
they're,
can tell there was a group miscommunication, I think,
yeah.
because people are like hearing different things. So
Yeah, no,
I
I'm
didn't
not,
know.
I'm not, yeah, I'm just saying, like, these are things I had written down I think we should consider, and just, like, how we're layering the things, like, if we want, because it seems like some of the parts are a little bit heavier in part 3 than others, so, like, maybe having more of the other roles doubled, or thinking about, do we want those little puffs of smoke to be, like, more canonic? Do we want them to be a little more sparse? Like, just some things to think about.
I think when I was going through part 3, I think there might have been like 2 roles that haven't been put in yet. I don't think, like, I know for me, I recorded the chaos part, but then I looked into Soundtrap. I was like, oh, other people are doing chaos. So I think I'm going to like do the newscaster part in section 3 to fill in that. If other people want to put in other spots too, yeah.
Well, let me ask a question. I think part of what I think in a perfect world, we would all be hanging out a lot and we'd be like, let's, have a group conversation like you just said, Alec. I'm not sure with our workflow. I think we are going to have to trust somebody to kind of make some decisions, and we can all respond to them. But meaning with part 3, I think there's a lot of different ways to sculpt it. Right now, I think it's based on the score, even I think it's too dense. So asking somebody to go in there and thin it out and make some calls so that then we can all respond to it tomorrow. And if nobody, it's feeling like maybe nobody wants to raise their hand or have time for that. So I'm happy to try it. Or Gavin, you can do part 1 and part 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. It does seem, when I'm looking at this Google Doc, to me, it seemed like, so it says Gavin and Alec are droning the individual part. Mary and John are the historian. Maritza and Luciano are chaos, and Jen is newscaster. Did that line up with what you all were thinking? Okay, cool. And has everybody added drones in there, or does anybody need to still do them? Gavin, is there both vibes, or Lucy? Yeah.
I need to do them still. I've done a lot. Alec and I did a lot of work on the historian recordings, and since we both share our apartment, trumpet and flute can't play at the same time a lot,
Sure.
so we've been
Yeah.
trying to coordinate how we record.
You know what I learned, though I'm going to keep it short because we should go, but I learned in Berlin, there are state mandated rules as to how long different instruments can play in an apartment building. So like my friend has a son who plays drums and he's allowed 30 minutes a day without complaint. And as soon as it's 31 minutes, they can call the cops and they're above the rules. But the flute and trumpet all have different rules as to how long they're allowed to play. Isn't that wild and very German? Okay, so maybe, so then, okay, questions. Part 4, so part 3 into part 4, there needs to be more overlap. Luciano, would you look at that? Or, we do, I agree with everything Alec just said. We do need to find a middle point to make it happen, to make the drones happen in the middle point, and we can do more work on this tomorrow. In part 4, there may be one part that's not played yet. Is anybody playing the chaos instrumental part?
I forgot to record that part. When listening,
Yeah,
I realized I didn't record that section.
Awesome, no worries. That's great. That's just good to know. That's good to know. Okay, cool. Well, so am I reading the room right? It feels like not so many people have time to commit to this between now and tomorrow. Maybe Gavin does have some excitement to commit to it. Because Gavin's raising his hand, we all have to trust that Gavin may make some choices that aren't exactly what we would do, but we'll be able to respond to them tomorrow and all bring our thoughts to the table, but know that in wrangling something like this, we're gonna start to trust folks to get it over the finish line. But to me, it feels like we're 85% in terms of having parts recorded, and then there's a lot of questions to still be answered on how to mix and wrangle it, right? Probably more than we just did, but awesome. And then, okay, so Gavin's gonna get it over the finish line. I'm just gonna ask the question, and I'm gonna assume maybe there's not. Does anybody have any thoughts on video that they'd like to bring to the table with a piece like this? Question mark.
It seems like the recordings that so Percussion has done is like taking visuals of newspapers and stuff and videos covering this kind of news. And I say this every time because I have a hard time like visualizing this piece, but maybe in the score, does it say that you should use those things, or is it just like whatever you would like to be the video can be the video?
Yeah, whatever we would like. I've directed those videos because I have no skills or interest in learning Final Cut or Adobe or anything. So whenever it gets dropped in my lap, I'm like, we're gonna spend, 20 minutes talking about what we're gonna do, and then we're gonna record a Zoom thing, and that's gonna be our video. And I like that limitation, and it feels like in a space that's so busy, we could say, okay, Thursday, we're gonna make a video together. And I think that's what SoSI's done. We've tried to make it an artistic, creative limitation, but it's been a limitation because none of us, are really other type video makers really. But if there's interest there, Jen, I think that's a cool space to go, but we can go anywhere we want.
I have two ideas. One I said to Alec was just that each of us individually takes like 20 minutes and we go outside and we try and pick up litter and we record that. And that's like our video because it's like making an impact, And then another one that I had was maybe finding people who are like climate change activists and also like people of color who fall into that category, and just giving them like a space where you show like an image of them and like social media or contact information so that you're promoting them. That was my other idea, to like give them the light and like individually show each of those people in ways that you can follow them so that they have support.
I love those ideas. The doing something on video that then becomes a video feels really powerful in a cool, direct kind of way. But either also making space for the second idea you had that feels really wonderful and powerful as well. I like those ideas.
Thanks.
Are there any other ideas? You're welcome.
Put in the chat, showing very chaotic videos of climate change and its effects could be powerful. And I think that like, not to like push down what anybody else has been saying, but it would be more like similar to what we've been doing with like researching people speaking and things like that, and then throwing that in. So this could be like a very similar creative thing. I don't know if that's the route we want to go, but it would definitely be easier in the sense that we don't have to record anything. Not that I care either way. It's just another idea.
I had the idea about the litter thing, and then I was like, we already have a lot like going on during this time, so I wouldn't want to give somebody else like another like physical thing that they need to go do.
Yeah, it's funny. In some ways to me though, if we all recorded ourselves for 10 minutes doing something, and then we put that together as a video, or we got on Zoom and held that up as, to me, that seems like the quicker way to do it actually. But I like your idea too, Gavin, for sure. Why don't we, since we weren't planning to spend a whole hour right now, why don't we know tomorrow we're gonna have to listen through where we're at, continue to make a production list to make it better, and then we'll need to make a decision on where to follow with video. But knowing that there's a few ideas in the room feels really good. I guess it could be, would anybody, I can try to, if anybody has a chance to try to pick up anything for 10 minutes, or yeah, that I think that's also a great idea, Jen, that it is really clearly different sections in terms of even what the music's trying to say too. So it could be interesting to show the cause and effect a little bit, chaos and then the positivity. Yeah, I think that's great. But if anybody had a chance to do any of these things, I think looking at something and making choices based on something is always really good, as opposed to an abstract conversation.
I don't mind, because I feel like I'm not contributing like an additional thing to the music editing. I don't mind like thinking of ideas about how we could have these things all included, and then messaging the group with like a process of like what we can include, and we could talk about it.
Jen, I think that's wonderful. You're hired. Congratulations. We have a video designer, director, and audio engineer, producer to our band. You've been hired, Gavin and Jen. Okay, awesome. Anybody who has a chance to add some sounds that we need by tomorrow, that's great. Gavin, if you want to go in and do some more wrangling of individual sections, that's really great. And also, it's possible that tomorrow I can sit with Gavin or Luciano or anybody who's interested in that side, and I can help make some decisions too in terms of form. I mean, with anybody. Okay, cool. Progress. Thumbs up to progress. Thanks for making time for this right now, you guys. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.